There's something uniquely infuriating about being yelled at in your own backyard while holding a tray of freshly grilled ribs. Turn this racket off right now, screeched Marlene Cartwright, the HOA vice president standing at the edge of my pool, like she owned the place. Her perfectly manicured hand pointed at my Bluetooth speaker, like it had personally insulted her. You're in violation of the community noise ordinance, and there are too many people. This is an unauthorized gathering. I sat down the tray on the patio table, still dripping from a quick dip in the pool, and gave her a look like she just tried to cancel. Christmas, Marlene, it's a Saturday. It's 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and it's a pool party. What do you think people do at pool parties? She huffed. This neighborhood has rules, Mr. Camden Monroe. You can't just invite half the city and blast music like this is a nightclub. And by the way, you're not even listed as a resident of this home in our records. This looks like a renter situation, and renters aren't allowed to host community events. The audacity almost made me laugh, but I held it in. Instead, I took a sip of my lemonade and glanced at my guests, mostly other homeowners from the neighborhood and a few friends from work. Everyone had frozen mid-con conversation because of Marlene's screeching entrance. I raised my voice just enough to be heard. Marlene, I own this house. I also own the one across the street and the one next door. She blinked, clearly thrown off. That doesn't matter. You're not on the HOA-approved residency list. We can fine you, or depending on the board's vote, remove you from the neighborhood entirely for non-compliance. That's when I started laughing full-on belly laugh, because this woman standing in her pastel pink visor and linen slacks had no idea who she was threatening. I walked over to my patio chair, grabbed a folder from under a towel, and handed it to her. Here's a copy of the deed, and here's something else, board member signatures from when I bought this entire cul-de-sac 3 years ago. I rent out 2 of the homes, but this is mine. I live here, and by the way, I'm also your landlord. Marlene's face went pale. What are you talking about? You remember when the HOA leased this clubhouse and pool property from a private owner? I said, tapping the folder. That owner was me. I bought it through an LLC. You've been mailing rent checks to Camden Holdings for the last 36 months. That's me. You've been renting your own HOA office from me. She opened the folder and scanned the documents, her mouth opening and closing like a confused goldfish. You can't. This has to be a mistake, she muttered. I don't make those, I said, then turned to wave at my guests. Everyone pool parties back on the music kicked in again. People started cheering and Marlene stood frozen, still clutching the folder like it might explode. Then she did what every HOA Karen does when their power starts slipping. She threatened retaliation. This isn't over, she hissed. You may own the land, but the board has authority over neighborhood compliance. Expect a notice of violation. By Monday morning, I leaned in just enough so she could hear me over the music. Great, I'll be reviewing your lease renewal on Monday too. And let's just say you might want to start looking for a new meeting space. She stormed off, nearly tripping over a pool float shaped like a flamingo. And just like that, my chill Saturday turned into a showdown. But she had no idea that I had been waiting for this because Marlene and her little HOA had been skimming Monai off resident dues for years, and I had the documents to prove it. She wanted war good. I'd already started digging her grave. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp, cloudless sky that only made Marlene's sour attitude feel more out of place by 9. I was already at my desk in the sunroom, laptop open, coffee in hand, and a stack of HOA financial records spread across 2 manila folders. I'd spent Sunday evening pulling bank statements, lease agreements, and scanned copies of checks that had been quietly piling up from the association's rent payments. They had no idea I'd been keeping everything. I didn't buy 3 houses in this neighborhood because I liked the landscaping. I did it because I knew something was off. Marlene and her little circle of clipboard commandos had been issuing fines like confetti for years, and it didn't add up. The HOA dues were higher than any of the surrounding developments, yet the playground was falling ape. Apart, the walking trail lights had been out for months, and the clubhouse roof still had a tarp on it from a hailstorm. 2 summers ago, I wasn't just going to kick the hornets' nest. I was going to smoke it out at exactly 10:15. My doorbell rang through the window. I could see a manila envelope in the hand of a woman I didn't recognize. Tall, maybe mid-40s, dressed like she'd come straight from a real estate seminar. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "You Camden Monroe?" she asked, holding the envelope between two fingers. "That's me. I'm delivering a formal notice of violation on behalf of the HOA board," she said, regarding unapproved events, noise complaints, and unauthorized use of private property. They've scheduled a hearing for Friday. I took the envelope and flipped through the pages. The handwriting on the complaint pages was unmistakably Marlene's tight, aggressive loops and an overuse of red ink that made it look like a teacher grading a failing essay. "Thanks," I said, then added, "You live in the neighborhood?" "Not anymore," she muttered, already turning back toward her car. "That board eats people alive." I watched her drive off before heading back inside. I had until Friday to prepare, but I wasn't planning to wait that long. That afternoon, I walked into City Hall with 2 folders and a USB drive. The clerk at the zoning department looked up, startled. "I need to pull the public records for the HOA's financial disclosures from the last 5 years. I said, "Sure, we can get that for you." She said, typing quickly, "Are you a resident or a board member?" "Technically both." I replied. An hour later, I walked out with copies of their annual reports, which were required under the city's nonprofit compliance statutes. 5 years of data, thin on detail, heavy on question marks, according to their own disclosures. The HOA had collected just under $1 million in dues and fines during that period, but their expenditures told a different story. Tens of thousands paid to a landscaping company that didn't exist in the business registry. A maintenance contractor listed as Community Solutions, LLC, which turned out to be registered to the HOA treasurer's cousin. And the real kicker, payments marked as office rent that didn't match the lease I held with them. They were logging inflated amounts on the public books, well above what I was charging. Someone was pocketing the difference by Tuesday. I was sitting across from Detective Raquel Sandoval at the precinct downtown. She didn't need much convincing. "You're telling me the HOA has been reporting inflated expenses to cover up embezzlement?" she asked, flipping through the documents I brought. "Exactly. And here's the kicker, they're using fake vendors and ghost companies to move the money. I can give you names, addresses, the whole paper trail." She leaned back in her chair, tapping a pen against the folder. "You realize if this pans out, we're looking at multiple counts of fraud, possibly mail fraud too. If they've been sending these records to the state, that's what I'm counting on." She gave a short nod. "I'll open a case. Don't tip them off. Let us handle contact. If they call a hearing this Friday, go act like you don't know anything. I can do that Wednesday." I kept my head down. No contact with the board, no phone calls. But I did have a quiet breakfast meeting at the diner down on Main Street with 2 of my tenants and a homeowner named Ellis, a retired accountant who'd been fined over $800 last year for non-conforming mailbox color. He'd painted it back the same day. "I've been saying something's off for years," Ellis told me, shaking his head. "They fine me for weeds. Once I had Czar escaping literal rocks, they're not just overreaching," I said, sliding a copy of the city records toward him. "They're laundering money through fake vendors, and I've already got a detective on it." He stared at the page, mouth tightening. "You want me to speak up? I want everyone who's been bullied, fined, or ignored to show up Friday. They're counting on people staying quiet. Let's make it crowded by Thursday." Word had spread quietly, but effectively. I didn't post online. I didn't make calls. I just had coffee with a few neighbors. And they did the rest. The board had spent years isolating people, making them feel like they were the only ones being singled out, once folks started comparing notes. The illusion shattered. Friday arrived, and I dressed like I was going to brunch, khakis, short sleeve button down, nothing flashy. The hearing was scheduled for 10 a.m. at the rented clubhouse, my property, which I unlocked for them that morning. Marlene was already there, along with the rest of the board. Frank, the treasurer, with the fake contractor cousin Denise, the compliance officer who once fined someone for wind chimes, and Harold, who mostly just nodded a lot. They looked up as I entered and immediately stiffened. Marlene narrowed her eyes. "Mr. Monroe," she said, voice clipped. "Thank you for attending. Please be seated." I did, choosing a chair directly across from them. The rest of the room was filling fast now. Mr. Monroe. Marlene began these include unapproved events, failure to submit guest lists, and repeated noise infractions. She barely got through the list before the door opened again. Detective Sandoval and two uniformed officers stepped inside. Marlene's voice faltered. "Excuse me, this is a private." "No, ma'am, it's not Sandoval," said, holding up a warrant. "This is a public meeting held by a registered nonprofit, and we have reason to believe that financial crimes have been committed by members of this board." Gasps rippled through the room. Frank stood up, sputtering. "This is outrageous. You can't just—" "We can," Sandoval said, already handing over subpoenas. "You're being served all financial records, digital communications, and vendor contracts are now subject to seizure." Marlene went pale. Denise looked like she might faint. Harold just sat there blinking. I leaned back in my chair, arms folded, said nothing. They weren't just going to lose control of the board, they were going to lose everything. The moment the detective began reading out the charges, the entire room shifted. People who had once stayed silent at HOA meetings were now leaning forward, murmuring to each other, watching every board member like they were specimens in a glass case. Marlene didn't even try to stand. She stared straight at Sandoval's eyes, locked and jaw tight, like she was calculating how fast this could all be swept under a rug. Frank, on the other hand, was sweating through his collar. He kept shifting in his chair, eyes darting toward the door like he might bolt. Denise stared at the table, fingers tapping in an uneven rhythm, while Harold looked like he was trying to remember if he'd ever signed anything. Sandoval handed off a thick envelope to one of the officers, who began collecting devices from the board's table. Laptops, tablets, even a flash drive that Frank had half buried under a folder. "Let's start with the falsified maintenance contracts," Sandoval said, plainly. "Community Solutions, LLC does / Mr. Monroe." Marlene began these include unapproved events, failure to submit guest lists, and repeated noise infractions. She barely got through the list before the door opened again. Detective Sandoval and two uniformed officers stepped inside. Marlene's voice faltered. "Excuse me, this is a private." "No, ma'am, it's not Sandoval," said, holding up a warrant. "This is a public meeting held by a registered nonprofit, and we have reason to believe that financial crimes have been committed by members of this board." Gasps rippled through the room. Frank stood up, sputtering. "This is outrageous. You can't just—" "We can," Sandoval said, already handing over subpoenas. "You're being served all financial records. Digital communications and vendor contracts are now subject to seizure." Marlene went pale. Denise looked like she might faint. Harold just sat there blinking. I leaned back in my chair, arms folded, said nothing. They weren't just going to lose control of the board, they were going to lose everything the moment the detective began reading out the charges. The entire room shifted. People who had once stayed silent at HOA meetings were now leaning forward, murmuring to each other, watching every board member like they were specimens in a glass case. Marlene didn't even try to stand. She stared straight at Sandoval, eyes locked and jaw tight, like she was calculating how fast this could all be swept under a rug. Frank, on the other hand, was sweating through his collar. He kept shifting in his chair, eyes darting toward the door like he might bolt. Denise stared at the table, fingers tapping in an uneven rhythm, while Harold looked like he was trying to remember if he'd ever signed anything. Sandoval handed off a thick envelope to one of the officers, who began collecting devices from the board's table. Laptops, tablets, even a flash drive that Frank had half buried under a folder. "Let's start with the falsified maintenance contracts," Sandoval said plainly. "Community Solutions, LLC does for bankruptcy 4 years ago, and yet, according to your records, you've paid them nearly $60,000 since last spring." "I don't handle the bookkeeping," Marlene said quickly, voice clipped but steady. "That would be the treasurer's responsibility. I sign checks based on board-approved budgets." Frank opened his mouth, but Denise cut in before he could speak. "That's not true. You insisted on approving every vendor after the lawsuit in 2019. I was in the room when you told us no one gets paid without your signature." Marlene turned sharply. "You're misremembering." "I'm not," Denise said, her voice rising, "and I'm not going down for you." Sandoval raised her hand. "Let's keep this orderly. We'll be conducting individual interviews starting this afternoon." None of you are under arrest at this time, but you are all named in the preliminary investigation. I suggest you don't leave the county." The silence that followed was thicker than anything I could have planned, for neighbors who'd once whispered complaints about mailbox sizes and lawn lengths were now exchanging wide-eyed glances, stunned that the people who'd been smart, they'll lawyer up and start flipping on each other, I said. But yeah, at least one of them is going down. The fake vendors alone could land someone a felony. By that evening, the neighborhood was buzzing, but not in the usual, behind the curtain sort of way. People were talking openly, holding impromptu sidewalk conversations. Someone even wheeled out a cooler and shared bottled water like it was a block party. The next morning, I received a call from Sandoval. "We've confirmed that at least 2 of the vendors listed in the records don't exist," she said. "Frank has already offered a statement. He claims Marlene orchestrated the whole thing and used HOE funds to pay off her son's debts. Did he have proof? He's producing emails and bank transfers. Also, we found a routing number on one of the checks that leads back to a personal account. In Marlene's name." I paused. "So she was laundering money through a shell company, then depositing it into her own account." "Exactly. And here's where it gets worse. We pulled the HOA's insurance filings. Turns out, Marlene filed a fraudulent claim 2 years ago for clubhouse storm damage, claimed the roof needed total replacement. The funds were dispersed, but no repairs were made. You still have a tarp up there, right? Still flaps in the wind when it storms. We're opening a second case for insurance fraud." That afternoon, I met with Ellis and a few other homeowners in the backyard, not for a party, just a quiet gathering to draft a formal petition for temporary dissolution of the current HOA board. Pending investigation, we had over 30 signatures within the hour. As we wrapped up, a woman named Leanna, who lived 3 houses down, approached me with a folder. "I've been keeping records too," she said. "Emails, letters, fines that didn't match any code. I didn't know what to do with it, but now she handed it to me. Inside were copies of correspondence showing that Marlene had cited non-existent regulations to pressure residents into voluntary contributions for neighborhood upgrades that never happened." Ellis read over her shoulder. "These are shakedowns she was inventing, rules and threatening people with liens. Let's add it to the pile." I said, "The more we have, the cleaner." The rebuild the following week. The city council scheduled a hearing to evaluate the HOA's legal status. They didn't take long. With mounting evidence and growing public pressure, the council voted unanimously to place the HOA under temporary receivership. That meant Marlene and her crew were officially out, and a court-appointed administrator was stepping in to untangle the mess. The administrator, a sharp woman named Judith Keener, called a public meeting that Friday. She didn't waste time sugarcoating. "What I've seen here is a textbook case of unchecked authority and zero oversight," she said. "You've been living under a shadow board that ends now. We're freezing the HOA's bank accounts, suspending all fines, and issuing reimbursements were supported by evidence." A cheer went up in the room. Real honest relief after the meeting. Judith pulled me aside. "I read the lease agreements you provided, the way you structured them, capped rents, community access, rolling renewals. You weren't just investing in property, you were building a buffer. I've lived under tyrants before," I said. "Figured I'd rather be the wall than the punching bag." She nodded. "Keep the records coming, and if you ever want to take a seat on the interim board, I back it." I didn't answer. Immediately, I looked around the room. Neighbors who used to avoid eye contact, now laughing, planning repairs, organizing a cleanup of the park. "I'm not sure I need a title." I said, "Finally, I've got a grill, a speaker, and a backyard. That's more power than they ever had." She laughed. Fair enough. That night, the pool lights finally got replaced by a group of homeowners who pulled their own tools and time. Someone hung string lights across the fence line. Kids played Marco Polo, while parents sipped iced tea and talked about bylaws without fear. And as I watched from my deck, arms folded across my chest, I thought back to that first confrontation, to Marlene's voice, shrill and entitled, threatening to kick me out of my own home. She'd forgotten one thing. I wasn't just living here, I own the ground. She stood on a week after the HOA board was formally removed. The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs as the evidentiary hearing began. The city had moved quickly, and the presiding judge, Nora Whitaker W.